Okay, good morning. So we are doing today Chaf Vav and Aleph. We'll finish the parak. In order to do so, we have to go on from Chaf Ham Beis we were yesterday. Yesterday at the end we had to rush, and what I'd like to do is just to review the point that we made yesterday, namely that the Gemara said that Akum Arum, the halacha is it's usher likrois Kriyas Shema. By an Akum Arum, it's usher to be reading the Kriyas Shema. What does it mean, an Akum Arum? So why the Gemara said do we talk about an Akum Arum? Why aren't we talking about even a Jew? Of course, like why specifically an Akum? The Gemara said, of course, by a Jew it's pashut that a Jew who is not dressed will be usher to read the Shema. The Chiddush was an Akum. Why? Because the pasuk says Shabasar Chamarim Besarim Zir Masusim Zir Masam, and maybe you would think that they didn't have a din of erva. Kamash Malan the erva Savihem Loi Ra'u. Now you see that Bnei Noach they have a din of erva as well, and therefore an akum arm is also to read the Shema. Now I pointed out yesterday quickly, and just to review again now, that we should just note that this idea of the akum and what their din is a very hotly debated topic. For our purposes now, just to summarize, what we're saying is that when it comes to yichus by a guy, ein av lemitzri, we say that they don't have yichus. So therefore, in that sense, we don't consider them uh, uh, like us. So therefore, number one, there are implications of Asher B'Sach Amarim B'Sarim V'Zir Masusim V'Zir Matim. That's one, as it relates to Yichus. Number two, another area where we find the fundamental difference is the position of Rabbeinu Tam. That position of Rabbeinu Tam is not agreed with by all the Balei Taisus. Taisus brings down the Rivam, who disagrees strongly. But nevertheless, it's a worthwhile shita to understand. And the position of Rabbeinu Tam in the beginning of Kesubas Gimel and Beis is that Rabbeinu Tam holds, based upon this pasuk, Asher B'Sar Chamarim B'Sarim Zir Masusim Zir Masam, that when it comes to a guy, that there is no din for a woman about Gili Arayas, the din of Chil of Mitzah for Gili Arayas for a woman who's Karka Olam wouldn't be the same kind of din of Chil of Mitzah. Why? Because of the fact that the Rabbeinu Tam views it as a Be'ilas Mitzri as a Be'ilah of just any other. It's not considered a human being in that sense to be mechayev of the woman to give up her life. That Tesis brings the right down from Esther. Correct. It's the Gemara Sanhedrin. Why the Gemara asks Esther's befarhesia instead of asking whether or not Esther is in fact Gilei Arayis. So, without getting into the position of whether or not Rabbeinu Tam is the halacha, because clearly he's not adopted the halacha. Nevertheless, it has another practical implication, and that is in the situation of what we say normally, asur l'baal, asur l'boil, by a woman who had an affair. Taisa says that it wouldn't apply if the affair was with a guy who then converted. He would be able to marry her. Not Taisa is not saying, Rabbeinu Tam is not saying because he's a new person. He's a berech hadasha once he became into the mikveh. No, he's able to marry her. Why? Because of the fact that the original bia is not considered a bia of a regular boil, and therefore he is not become aser to her. So these would be some of the implications of understanding this, but it goes into a wider debate. And this is a famous text that I mentioned yesterday quickly. It appears in many places that the Torah says, or at least Reb Shimon Yochai says, that when the Torah says the word Adam, it's not referring to Goyim, it's only referring to Yidden. And Tess says that can't be correct. There's many psukim that clearly in the use of the word Adam and it refers to humanity, not just the Jewish people. And Tess makes a distinction between Adam and Ha-Adam. Now, when it comes to the word Adam, it only refers to Jews, but Ha-Adam refers to the bipeds, two-legged beings, and that includes all of humanity. This is sort of a little bit more in depth for the point that I wanted to bring out yesterday. Next, New Gemara, where we are, is the two dots on Chav Hema Beis, about halfway down. V'lo yaskasa, v'lo yaskasa, loy b'mayim haroim, v'loy b'mei hamisra ashi yatzal atoichan mayim. This is again a reference to the Mishnah. The Mishnah had said if somebody was in water he is not able to be sort of covering himself to be able to recite the Shema with Mayim Haroyim or Mayam Misra. Rashi didn't explain in the Mishnah, but here Rashi explains what is Mayam Misra. It's the water that was used for like flax. I'm not exactly sure how they would take the flax and make the linen, but they had copious amounts of water there, and the water was not very pleasant. So in such a situation, a person is not able to be reciting the Shema until he's putting in water. So the Gemara wants to understand the kama maya rami va'ozil. How much water is sufficient in order to be able to consider this a situation where he's not covered in unpleasant water, and therefore he should be able to recite the Shema. So Gemara says no. That's clearly not going to work out. Why not? Because the amount of water one would need if one is surrounded by Mayim Haroyim or Mayam Misra would be a lot of water. It would not be the kind of water that one would simply be able to. Remember, the case that we're talking about is a situation where it was the amount of Kriya Shema. So you take in water and take away the problem. You need a huge amount of water. Just get out, dry yourself off, and say Shema. Like for the amount of time that it would take to get rid of the problem, you have enough time to get dressed and say the Shema. So clearly that's not what we're discussing. So the Gemara wants to explain what then is exactly what we're discussing. So the Gemara says as follows: this is actually what we're trying to say when the Mishnah went. In a situation where you're finding yourself that you are surrounded by brackish water or Mayam Misra, that doesn't work to cover yourself up at all. Like that's not an option. You don't have an option to use that kind of water and add in more water, and then you're gonna say, okay, we can say Shema now. Like no, that water is brackish, disgusting, it's dirty. It's not gonna be changed by you adding in any amount of water. That's not what we're dealing with here. So period. That's it. That doesn't work. It's not an option for you to say Shema in such water. However, umeiraglayim, which we thought was not necessarily what was going on there, is like talking about these as separate cases. Now we're saying no. We're talking now. Achiatel Teichamayim is not a reference to Iskasamayim Ram Misra, and you're not adding water to that because that's never good. What we're talking about is adding water to Meiraglayim. If you have a situation where it was Meiraglayim, not that you're bathing in Meiraglayim, but there's Meiraglayim that's there, Meiraglayim in a container. So the halacha is and sheyantel l'toichan mayim v'yikor. Then you could say the Shema, but only after you add water to the Meiraglayim. So now the Gemara wants to understand if you're able to dilute the Meiraglayim in such a manner that it becomes sort of diluted enough that you're able to now say the Shema, how much of water are we talking about? And when are we talking about? What is the order of operations of when the water and the Meiraglayim went into this container? So the Gemara explains. Says the Gemara, Tana Rabbanan, the rabbis taught as follows: Kama yatil l'toichan mayim. How much water do you have to put in order to sort of be mevatel that will be permitting you to be able to say the Shema? So the first opinion is kolshu, even a small amount of water would be sufficient. Rav Zakkai revius. Rav Zakkai says no, you need more than just a small amount of water. You need to put in a revius. Now, what's not clear is, of course, what amount of water are we actually talking about? Are we talking about a situation where the container of water is like some gargantuan, sort of samovar sized thing of Meiraglayim, and you're putting in kolshu, you're putting in a revius, or we're talking about some smaller amount? That's not clear from the Gemara. But be it as it may, the for our purposes now, the Gemara says at least the first understanding is that what we are dealing with the machlekes of kolshu and revius, which sounds like from this reading that the Meiraglayim was there first, and you're being mevatel by putting in either a revius or a kolshu. But now, as we'll see, that wasn't so simple. Says the Gemara, Amar Rav Nachman, machlekes lebesoif aval betchila kolshu. What Rav Nachman says is the machlekes is lebesoif, but tchila initially it's kolshu. Rashi explains. What are we talking about? Machlekes lebesoif, says Rashi. Right. I should point out the Rashi before. Right, so Rashi it says, you can't put in water into the Mei Misra or the Mei Roim, it's too much, you're never going to be able to dilute it. Umeiraglayim, mu'atin, Rashi says, V'heim Bekli, we're talking about a small amount of Meiraglayim, and that's in a jug. Rashi is adding in mu'atin because the Gemara didn't say. The Gemara didn't explain. But obviously, we're not talking about a situation you have some gargantuan, swimming pool size of meraglaim, and you think you're being mevatel with a revius or a kolshu. Some are meraglaim muatin, and that's when we're having a debate about being mevatel with either a revius or a kolshu of water. So Rashi explained that the machlekes, according to the first opinion, we're going to have two-way machlekes here, but according to the first opinion, the opinion of Rav Nachman says machlekes libesayif. What does that mean? Shemei raglayim beklizeh. Machlekes is at the end, meaning you had already in the jar, you had in the jug meraglayim. And then the person is adding in water to that. That's where Rav Zakkai says you need a revius, and the other mandama says no. You could have just a what do you call a kolshu. Avo betchila. But betchila, what does it mean betchila? Betchila means that there's nothing right now in this jug. You adding in water, and then there's going to be meraglam that comes into it. How much meraglam is going to come into it? And that would be mevatel to the initial water. Says the Gemara that according to the way Rab Nachman is learning, when you initially have water in it, a kolshu of water in the jug, and then there's some meraglam that goes in. Each bit of meraglam that goes in is bottle to the initial water that's there before it. So when you put in an initial bit of water, just a kolshu of water into a jug, and then you have a little bit of meraglam that goes in. That little bit of meraglam that goes in becomes bottle to the initial water that was there. So now you have the initial water plus a little bit of meraglam, which is all now considered water. Now you have another bit of meraglam that comes in. Well, guess what? That is now being a mevatel to the initial water that was in it, which is actually containing both meraglim and the initial water. And then each bit of meraglim that comes in is continually being mevatel to the initial kolshu of water that went in. So according to the way Rav Nachman wants to learn, if there was nothing in the jug of meraglim, just a bit of water, then all of the meraglim that comes in afterwards, since it's coming in piece by piece by piece, even if it's coming in a steady stream, each bit of it is mevatel to the initial water that was there beforehand. And since each bit of meraglim is going to be mevatel to the kolshu water that was there before, the entire meraglim is able to be mevatel. This is the opinion of the first understanding. This is the opinion of Nachman. But now we have a second opinion. And the opinion of Rabbi Yosef. Rabbi Yosef disagrees. Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yosef says the opposite. Rabbi Yosef says, you know what the machlekes is? The machlekes is lechatchila. In other words, if you're putting in water into a jug, and the question becomes how much meraglayim is able to be mevatel into that water. That's where you have a machlekes, says Rabbi Yosef. Some say you have to have a kolshu, but some say no, you have to have a revius. If you want to mevatel the meraglayim that comes after, you have to have a revius of water there initially. But continues the Gemara, and the Gemara says, "Lebesayif." According to where Rabbi Yosef is learning, everybody needs a revius. That is to say, once you have meraglayim in the jug, then everybody holds you need a revius in order to be able to mevatel it. Again, we're talking about a situation where it's meraglayim mu'atim. We're talking about a situation with some massive amount of meraglayim. Obviously, this is not going to apply. So we have a machlekes between Rab Nachman and Rab Yosef as to where is the machlekes between the Tanakama and Rab Zakkai. Says the Gemara, Amar le Rab Yosef, le Shameh. Rab Yosef said to his Shames, Aisali Rav Yosef the Maya to Rab Zakkai. Rab Yosef is saying to his Shames, please get me a revius of water. He had, I guess, meraglayim in a jug, and he says, please get me a revius of water because I want to mevatel it like Rab Zakkai. What do you mean like Rab Zakkai? This is a situation where the meraglayim is there first, and if the meraglayim is there first, right? If the meraglayim is there first, according to the Rabbi Yosef himself said it, Divrei Hakol is Revius. Right? If the Meraglaim is there first, then everybody holds that you need a Revius, according to the Rabbi Yosef learned. So what do you mean? It's Kirab Zakai? What's the var? You hear the question? According to the Rabbi Yosef learned, Rabbi Yosef says that Divrei Hakol in Lebesayf is Revius. And the Rabbi Yosef is saying to Hisham is isolated Revius of the Maya Kirab Zakai. What does it mean Kirab Zakai? He holds as Divrei Hakol in that situation. So you have to see Rashi to answer the question. And Rashi, in 2 words, delicious, right? What does Rashi say? Isolate Reviasa, afilu betchila. In other words, from the reading of this lashon of Rabbi Yosef, you would have thought that Isili Reviasa Demaya meant in a situation when it was already meraglaim in a jug, and he's saying you have to now give me a Revias, please, because I want to mevatel it. And we said, well, what's the big chiddush then? According to Rabbi Yosef, Divrei Hakol, everybody holds if there's meraglaim initially in the jug and you want to come mevatel, you need Revias. So what do you mean Kirav Zakai? It's according to everybody. Does Rashi know? You have to read Rabbi Yosef a little bit differently. Rashi is saying that Rabbi Yosef was not talking about a situation when it was necessarily meraglaim there first. Could be there was no meraglaim there at all. He's about to go to the bathroom. He wants to mevatel it. How's he going to mevatel it? He says, I want a Revias of water now. I'm going to pour it into the jug. And then they'll put in the meraglaim, and I'll have the meraglaim that's put in become batal. Why? Because of the fact that we're going with Reb Zakkai, because in Betchila, when there was no water initially, no meraglaim initially in the jug, and you're just putting in water, there Rabbi Yosef holds that's a machlekes. If you need a revius like Reb Zakkai or kolshu. So you see from Rashi's adding in the words afilu betchila that you have to clarify what Rabbi Yosef was saying to his shamus was not specifically talking about a situation where there was already a meraglaim in the jug. The jug could have been totally empty, and he wants to mevatel what the meraglaim that's going to go into the jug. How does he mevatel it? By first asking for revius, pouring it in, then putting in the meraglaim, which will then become batel. That's what again, he's saying that before the meraglaim is in the jug, then there was machlekes. Then there was machlekes if you need a revius or koshu. And Rabbi Yosef is holding like Rab Zakkai. That's what the Gemara means. When he says Ki Rab Zakkai, he meant because I hold like Rab Zakkai that betchila you need to put in a revius in order to mevatel it. So it comes out very beautifully because if it would be b'seif, it wouldn't have said Ki Rab Zakkai because it would be divrei hakal. Everybody agrees that you would have to put in a revius. Okay, continues the Gemara. Again, there was a situation of any smell. We're not talking about a situation. We have to look at each case in isolation. Each case has to be understood as a minor part of a wider picture. Obviously, smell we've dealt with separately, but there's not dealing with a situation of any issue of smell here. And again, not just the issue of smell here, right? We had yesterday in the Gemara. You remember the Gemara said on Chafei Manal, the Gemara in the bottom said, "Kli shenishbechu mimenu meraglaim aser." Right? If you have a kli which is pouring out of meraglaim, that would be aser. What this is doing is essentially saying, do you have meraglaim in this kli? Right? Let's say they had this kli here that you put in this revius. What we're saying is that this now doesn't have a din of meraglaim if you were mevatel correctly. So that meant to say that if, let's say now that was spilling, right? Would you be prevented from saying Shema? The answer would be no, right? What happens if it had a smell? What happens if you were able to see it? These will all be cases that are relevant to the question of if you have meraglaim. But the question that we're deciding today is, do you have meraglaim? Right? The discussion here is not what the consequences are about smell, about seeing it. The consequences here are earlier than that. Here the question is, do you have meraglaim? That's what we're donning today. Do you have meraglaim when you're mevatel? That's the question. And the answer to that would be no, you don't have meraglaim, but the question is how? How are you able to mevatel? Okay, next Gemara, Tana Rabbanan, Graf Shover A, the Abid Shel meraglaim. The Mefarshim explain that a chamber pot, right? Things that they used to carry, because to go to the outhouse, if it's living in Lithuania or Russia, you can imagine in those days it's very cold. It's not very comfortable to go to the outhouse in the middle of the night. So they had a bed chamber, right? A chamber pot. They had a chamber pot in the bed chamber, right? Where they would essentially go to the bathroom by the bed, and then they would clean it out in the morning. So that's what we're talking about. So for number 2, that's called the graf or A. And for number 1, it's called the avid, an avid of meraglaim. Just note that yesterday Rashi had told us With regards to the pig, we did it actually, I think, 2 days ago. We talked about the pig. Pi chazir kitsoya oiveris. If you look at Rashi over there in Chav Hey Amud Aleph, Rashi says, what does it mean, the piv of a chazir is tsoya oiveris? Adam shenoisim lefanav graf shel re'eh la'avira. A person who's carrying, right, a graf shel re'eh, a person who's carrying a chamber pot, that was the situation of tsoya oiveris. We consider that like literally feces going before you. So the Gemara says as follows: Tana Rabbanan and Graf Shavar Eva Avid Shalem Raglayim also liquor is Kriya Shema Kinegdon. It's also to read the Shema next to a chamber pot. Period. Full stop. Va'af apish ein vahen klum. Even though there's nothing in it. Even though there's nothing in it. What do you mean? What's wrong? What's wrong with reading the Shema next to a chamber pot? There's nothing in it. What do you think is wrong with it? Look at Rashi. Rashi says, "Graf ve'avit shneim kli cheres hein." These are both made out of earthenware. Ela sharei kari graf v'shamei raglaim kari avit. Says Taisus. Look at the Taisus. The Gra says that the last two Taisus and I really want Taisus. One of the only times that I'm aware of, maybe the only time, where the Gra says take out the two dots in the Taisus. He says it's not part of Taisus. It's all one Taisus. Says Taisus graf shel re'eh pirish Rashi shel cheres balua. Again, Rashi doesn't use the word balua that we have, but nevertheless, that's the definition of a cheres, right? That's why you don't have the ability to be toivel this kind of what's it called, china, right? Things kinds of cheres, right? Because of the fact that the food gets balua in it, gets balua, and the only way to deal with it when it comes to tumah, things like this, is breaking it. You don't have the ability to simply be capturing this kind of stuff that gets fully immersed in it with the things that went inside. Hold on. So it says Taisvis. So these kind of chamber pots of number one and number two is made out of earthenware, and the things that go inside it are sucked in and becomes part of it. Avokli says Taisvis the loibala, but a keli that doesn't have the ability to take in, it doesn't get balua. Like what? Like schuchas, like glass, right? Therefore, without getting anybody too excited, right, that is the reason why people would use glass for their fleshik and milchik. They wouldn't have different glasses. Why? Because clay schuchas, real glass. I don't mean I'm not talking about Pyrex. I'm not talking about anything else. Just true schuchas. I'm not going to get into that right now. But what I'm saying is true glass. Whatever true glass is not balua, and therefore it's effectively not going to take in anything. By the way, this is a relevant topic to also metal, right? And certain kinds of metal as well. But we're not going to be able to explore that here. So for the purposes now, Rashi had said that we're talking about a klicheres. The place says, oh, it's a klicheres. You know what the problem is? It's balua. But if it would be klichukets, if somebody had the glass chamber pot, I mean, I can't imagine why anybody would want a see-through chamber pot. But okay, if they had such a thing, maybe that would be after the show. Maybe that would be mutter then. Why? Because when you clean that out, it's cleaned out. So it doesn't get a fundamental nature of being a chamber pot. It may look like a chamber pot, but it may not have the same diddle. So Tes says maybe there will never still be a difference between a graph and an avit, because maybe for number two we are going to be more makbid. So again, huh? By shoshes, you're saying? Yeah. We said by shoshes, we said that it's what do you call it? Soya by shoshes was mutter liquor as kresh makanegda. Why? Because it said bekisu tali milsa, milsa, right? And there was covered. But everybody shoshes we said was also to be kresh because v'lo yera b'cha ervas davar, right? That there was a situation where one is the issue of just requiring covering, and one is that there shouldn't be any erva at all. So you're asking a question: why? How is it that if we said that yesterday that it's say about shoshes is mutter to be kriyashma, then why are we saying today that a graf shel a or abed shel meraglaim is also to be kriyashma? I'm assuming again, like Rashi said, there's nothing to do. Has nothing to do here with whether or not there's even tzay in it. We're saying even if there's no tzay in it, the issue here is a situation. Unless you're trying to say that's what Taisus means. Taisus doesn't bring down the Gemara before, but what we're saying here is it's nothing to do with tzaya. There's no tzaya in it. There's no tzaya in it. It's not a situation of that, right? But remember, the point here is not we're saying there's no covering. Yesterday we said it was bashoshes. It was a covering. Here we're saying there's no covering. Even if there's nothing in it, it's still considered a shtik tzaya. Why? Because it's made out of earthenware, and these things go inside it. So even if it's technically empty, it's still that's what it is. Obviously, if you covered the chamber pot, then you would have the same issue we said yesterday, which would be mutter. Okay, so continues the Gemara. Again, Tanarabban graf shor eva abba shor meraglaim. Also, liquor is kriyashma kenegdon. If you have a graf shor a or an abba shor meraglaim, the halacha is it's also to be kriyashma. Abba said it, the apple piece ain't behen klum. Even if it's totally what? Even if it's totally empty. I am sorry, I lost the place. Oh, okay. So meraglaim atzman achiatel techamayim. Meraglaim itself would be the halacha would be about meraglaim itself that it would be usher to recite the Shema until you put in water. The kama yatel techamayim, and how much would you have to put in? Kolshu. Dakiyama revius. Again, the same debate that we just had before. Then is the Gemara. Bein lifnei amita, bein la'achar amita. Whether it's before or after the bed. What do we mean when it's before or after the bed? Well, here we're trying to understand the bed as being essentially a chatzitza. So the Gemara explains. What does it mean? Bein lifnei amita, bein la'achar amita. Rav Shimon Gamliel Aimer la'achar amita karei, lifnei amita ene karei. Rav Shimon Gamliel says that if this sort of chamber pot is after the mita, meaning the bed is a chatzitza, so then that would be considered a situation where you could say Shema. But if it was before the bed, so in other words, the bed is not being a chatzitza, so then you're not supposed to say the Shema. You should distance yourself 4 amas, and then you could say the Shema. The bed is being like a chatzitza. It's a separation. Okay, we get it. You're jumping ahead. Hold on. So Rav Shimon ben Elazar says, "Afilu bayis mole amma." Even if you have a house that's 100 amas, meaning a very big house, lo yikurachi yitziim o shenichem tachas amita. You cannot say the Shema until you remove it from the house or you put it underneath the bed. That is to say, the bed is sort of like covering it. The bed is hiding it, and therefore that's what's giving you the heter to be able to recite the Shema. So again, Baruch Hashem, these debates are no longer relevant. We have nice bathrooms, but for our purposes now, the Gemara wants to understand what are we talking about. Heichi ka'amar Rabbi Shimon Gamliel achar mita. When did Rabbi Shimon Gamliel say that? As the Bach adds in, Rashi adds in also. For Rashi is explaining it. The Bach says put it actually into the Gemara. So we want to know when did Rabbi Shimon Gamliel say la'achar mita? You're able to say the Shema. What does that mean? Miyad, right? Does that mean like just put it after the bed, then you can say the Shema. Well, if the chamber pot is before the mita, then you have to distance yourself 4 amas and read. Maybe Rav Shimon was trying to say like this. Maybe it means that you have to be, the bed is a chatzitza, but you have to still distance yourself 4 amas in order to be able to say the Shema. But maybe he meant that you're not able to say the Shema at all. So it wasn't clear exactly what Rav Shimon Gamliel was trying to say. So the Gemara says, Tashma, I'll bring you a proof as to what Rav Shimon Gamliel was trying to say. The Tanya, because we have a brayso that says, if Shimon ben Elazar Aimer, Acha mita kar miyad, lifnei mita machik arba amas. When it's after the bed, you could read right away. So this one is very clear. You don't have to do any distancing. Once the bed is in between, then you're able to say the Shema right away. The bed is the chatzitza. But if it's before the bed, meaning where you are, so then then you have to distance yourself 4 amas in order to be able to recite the Shema. Rav Shimon Gamliel Aimer afilu bayis mea ama lo yikar asher yitziem or shenichem tachas amita. So Rav Shimon Gamliel says that you have a house that's 100 amas, you still can't read it, the Shema, until you take it out of the house, or you put it underneath the bed, that the bed becomes its covering. So the Gemara says, Bayin of Shitalon, you've now explained maybe an answer to the question, but Masnisa Kasha Adadi. So I don't, but you haven't really solved the problem, because now you have a problem with what's the position of Shimon Gamliel. But now you just said that the position of Shimon Gamliel is the position of the Shimon ben Elazar, right? So which one is it? It's easy to get confused. One is Shimon ben Gamliel, one is Shimon ben Elazar. I understand, but you've just switched around the shittas. So what have you solved by now telling me a new price that makes it clear that after the bed you can say the Shema right away. You don't have to be machik dalat amis. You've switched the shita. It's no longer the shita of Shem Gamliel. Now it's the shita of Shem and Elazar. So what do you do with this? So the Gemara says, Eipach Basrai. So let's change the Bryce that we just brought as a Rai. Let's change that. And therefore, we're going to say Rav Shimon Gamliel, in fact, holds the Fnei Mita Achar Mita is the distinction, and Rav Shimon Elazar holds that Tachas Mita, otherwise you have to take it out of the house. So the Gemara says, really? My chod is the Avchas Basrai, so Eipach Kamaisa. Why are you so easy to say that you could switch the Bryce that we just brought as a Rai? Maybe switch the first one. Which one do you think? Why do you think the second one is more amenable to switching? So the Gemara says, "Man shamas le da'amar kule ba'as ka'arba amas dami." Who is the one who's more likely to say that there is a way to look at a home, even if it's 100 amas, that is nevertheless still your dalat amas, so you have to take it out of the house? Reb Shimon Elazar. That is the position of Reb Shimon Elazar. Here, fascinatingly, we have the idea that Rashi tells us something about it. Rashi never tells us about himself directly. Very, very rarely we have a few things that we can learn and glean from Rashi about his life and who he was. Right? The Rambam is more, the Ramban, the others are much more open about things in their life. But Rashi tells us a lot about himself. As over here, Rashi says, "Lo yadati heichani." Rashi says, "I don't know. I don't know." The Gemara is telling us that who do you think is more likely to assume that 100 amma house can still be considered dal amas? That's Rabbi Shimon Elazar. Rashi says, "Lo yadati heichani." I don't know. I don't know where Rabbi Shimon Elazar is. Then look at the Gilyon Hashas. The Gilyon Hashas brings down tens of other examples. Rashi says, "I don't know." Interestingly, fascinatingly, he also brings down the Rashbam as part of it, because the Rashbam and Psachim in 10th parak, and then the Bava Basra, the second, after the first while of Bava Basra, we consider that potentially Rashi. So maybe that's why he brings it down as the Rashbam. That's a whole other question, but you certainly see that from Taisus over in those places. Taisus brings down the Rashbam as though it's Rashi. Okay, so now that was number one. Number two, the Rabbeinu Chanal disagrees. The Rabbeinu Chanal says very clearly, what's the reason why it's Rav Shimon Elazar? He has the right from Erevin. So again, why Rashi didn't think of the Gemara in Erevin? Do they disagree with the way? I don't know, and that would be too much for us to do right now. I also think it's worthwhile to just mention that there is the machlokes that Ritva brings down. The next Gemara that we're discussing here, that the Gemara says as follows. So, Amar Rabbi Yosef. So Rabbi Yosef says, we're up to about 10 lines down from the bottom. Amar Rabbi Yosef, boy, my name Rav Huna. So Rav Huna wants to know the following. Mita pachas mishleisha, shizli dami. Rabbi Yosef asked Rav Huna, it's pasha to me that a bed that's less than 3 tefachim off the ground is considered loved, like it's connected to the ground. In other words, the way Rashi learns and the way one of the positions of the Ritva learns is that this whole Gemara is about Rav Shimon ben Elazar, not about Rav Shimon ben Gamliel. Remember, we're talking now about going with the shittas of Rav Shimon ben Elazar, that tachas the bed, or it has to be out of the house. And Rav Shimon ben Gamliel means before the bed, dalat amas v'marchik, or after the bed, it's a good chatzitza. So this Gemara that Rabbi Yosef is asking, Boy, my name Rav Huna, is that going to Rav Shimon ben Elazar or Rav Shimon ben Gamliel? According to the way Rashi is learning, the situation that we are discussing is the situation of Shimon Elazar, that we're talking about underneath the bed, where that would be considered matmain, that would be considered hidden, and therefore it would be permitted to recite the Shema. I'm Rabbi Yosef. A bed that is less than 3 tefachim off the ground, it's partial to me that it's considered connected to the ground, and therefore it will be considered hidden underneath the ground, and therefore it will be permitted to recite the Shema. Like Shimon Elazar said, Shloisha, Arba, Chamisha, Shisha, Shiva, Shemana, Tishama. What's the din if it will be all those other tefachim? What's the din then? Amalei Lo Yadan says, I don't know. Asara, Rav Huna says, I don't know. Asara Vadilai Mebayli, but by 10 tefachim, of course, I'm not asking that as a question. Why? Because by 10 tefachim, it's for sure considered a new domain, and that new domain would not be considered a valid kisui, and so therefore it cannot be considered covering the chamber pot. So the Gemara says, Amar Rabbi, Shapra Vadat Lei Barlof. Makes sense. He didn't ask him about the 10 tefachim, because every 10 tefachim is considered a different rishus. Amar Rava says, if it's less than 3 tefachim off the ground, then it's considered love, but it's considered connected to the ground. And so therefore, if you put it under the bed, it's like it's being hidden in the ground, and therefore it's permitted to say the Shema. That's the position of Rav Shimon Elazar. However, but 10 tvachim above the ground, the bed is 10 tvachim above the ground, then it would not be considered a good separation. It would not be considered hidden, and therefore you would not be able to recite the Shema. It would not be considered according to Shimon Elazar until you took it out of the house. Then 3 to 10 is the question that we never got answered from Rav Huna. That is the one understanding of this Gemara. As I say, the Ritva has a second understanding of this Gemara, and the Ritva's second understanding of this Gemara, we're talking about Rav Shimon Gamliel. Unfortunately, we don't have the time right now to go into that, but this would then totally radically sort of reread this Gemara. But we're going to go with Rashi, and like I say, one of the pshatim in the Ritva. Fine. Amar Rav, halacha Rav Shimon ben Elazar. Rav says that the halacha is in fact like Rav Shimon ben Elazar, that in fact within a home, if you put the chamber pot underneath the bed, and the bed is relatively connected to the ground, it's 3 tvachim above the ground, then that will be considered hidden enough that you can say the Shema. Otherwise, you got to take it outside. V'chein Amar Bali, a few times we bring up in Shas this guy Bali. Amar Rav Yaakov, brother Bashmuel, Rav Yaakov, he said, Bali is quoting Rav Yaakov, the son of the daughter of Shmuel, right? Remember that we already discussed on Tezayin. Over there we said Rav Mary, who was brother of Shmuel. Here we're calling Rav Yaakov, maybe she had a few sons, I'm not sure. She had been boiled to a Nachri, who eventually converted. His name was Isser, but we don't call him by his father's name because it was Harasa Shaloi Bekdusha. So therefore we call him brother Bashmuel, and she was the daughter of Shmuel. So what did Rav Yaakov, brother Bashmuel, say? He said, Allah Rav Shimon ben Elazar. Again, same point. Rava Amar, and Rava says, the Rav says the halach like Rav Shimon ben Elazar, and so too Bali said that. In the name of Rabbi Yaakov, and the granddaughter of Shmuel, the grandson, of Shmuel. But Rava disagrees. Rava ain't halach Rav Shimon ben Elazar. Rava says no, the halach is not like Rav Shimon ben Elazar. Wonderful. So we have now all sorts of various opinions as to what the halach is. We cannot go more into it given our time limitations right now. So we continue the Gemara. Rav Achoy. So there we get to another fascinating Gemara. Also the beginning of Ksubis. Look at Ksubis Beis and a Beis. There again we have a big bomb. Taisus says that Rav Achoy, according to the opinion of the Rashbam, is a Rabbanan Savaroi. That's why in the Gemara, whenever it brings up Rav Achoy, it always says Parach Rav Achoy, Pashin Rav Achoy. He has like a special kind of way of referring to him because he's an Amira, because he's a Rabbanan Savaroi. And Tais disagrees with the Rashbam. Tais says no, Rav Achoy is from the Amiram. This Raya is this Gemara here will be a bomb Raya that what? The Rav Achoy is not from the Rabbanan Savaroi, that he was an Amira. And as Tais says in the beginning of Ksubis, the Amiram many times have their own signon. They have their own sort of lashon about them as well. What is the proof that Rav Achoy here has to be an Amira? Because it says in the Gemara, Yasik le'lebrei Rabbi Yitzchak bar Shmuel bar Marta, because he was going to have his son get married to the son of Rabbi Yitzchak, who was the son of Shmuel bar Marta. Right? This is we have many times of Shmuel bar Marta. This is Rav Shmuel Marta's son, Rabbi Yitzchak, and Rabbi Yitzchak, Rav Shmuel bar Marta had a son, and this is Rabbi Achoy. So we're talking about the 4th generation, 5th generation of Amiram, but it's still an Amira. It's still an Amira. Marta himself was from Rav, the same family. So Rabbi Achoy is bringing it to the chuppah. The chuppah will have a mistaya milsa. He brought him to the chuppah, but he wasn't able to be boiled. It wasn't working out. So he didn't understand. Rabbi Achoy didn't understand. So Azo Basri Yune. So he went to go figure out what's going on. Right? Why is my son not being able to be boiled? So Chaz Sefer Torah the Mancha. He saw a Sefer Torah in the house. She said, Omar Lahu Eichel. He says, "Oh my gosh, you had the Sefer Torah here in the house. You have caused my son to be in danger. What do you mean to be in danger? Because you literally, if he would have been boiled, he would be in the oven. He would be doing a major avera. To be boiled in a house where the Sefer Torah is there, not appropriate. So, like Baruch Hashem, that he was unable to. The Tanya. So, what do we mean? What's the basis of this? So again, we've discussed a lot about chamber pots. Now we're switching to talk about Sefer Torah. The Tanya Baish Sheyesh Sefer Torah Tefillin also Shamish Beres Samita. If you have a bias that has in a Sefer Torah or Tefillin, it's also to Mishamish. The reason being that you have a Davar Shebekdusha over there. Until you move it out, or you put it a kli b'seif kli. Amar Abaya, 1 second. Lo yishana el b'kli she'enai kelya. That's only talking about a situation where you have a kli that is not considered the kli of this thing. But a kli b'seif kli. that is where this thing normally sits. I feel sarmani kechad man adami. Even if you have 10 coverings, it doesn't make a difference. That's only considered one covering. Why? Because that's the normative thing to cover this thing with. If something that's normative to cover something with, then it does not get shame of a kli b'soich kli. That is the opinion of Abai. Amar Rava Glima Akamtra. We're on the top now of Chavav. Finally, so Rava says that if you put a covering on the top of a svarim shrank, right? A svarim shrank, a kamtra. Rashi is the arger shel svarim. You put a blanket on top of a svarim shrank. That's considered klibus sakli, and that would be sufficient. Taisus points out here, Sefer Torah Ursula Mechitza. Taisus dafka Sefer Torah, maybe by chumash, you should be machma like a Sefer Torah, but by shalosh svarim, dayim b'kisi ba'alma. Then it will be enough to just do a covering. So the Gemara says as follows: Amar Rav Yeshua ben Levi, Sefer Torah tzorach lasas lemechitza asara. Rav Yeshua ben Levi says the Sefer Torah is required to put in a mechitza of asar tzvachim. Arzutra ikul beir of Ashi. Arzutra came to Rav Ashi's house. Chazil dukta the marber of Ashi. He saw in marber the Rav Ashi's room the marach be Sefer Torah. And he saw that there was a Sefer Torah in the room, and there's a mechitza of asar tzvachim. Amalei kimak Rav Yeshua ben Levi. He says, you think to Rav Ashi. He says, you think you're doing like Rav Yeshua ben Levi? When did Rav Yeshua ben Levi say this? That you are allowed to effectively put in a mechitza of 10 tefachim. He didn't say it as ideally. He said it as not ideally, as b'di'evid. That is to say, if you don't have an option, you put a mechitza of 10 tefachim. But marha isla beis achrina. But you have other options. You have other houses. Amalei lava daitis. You're right. I didn't think about this. Now, this gives us a good segue to conclude the parak and the beginning of the parak in the same place. If you look at the beginning of the third parak, back on Yud Zayin and Beis, we talked about a Mesa Mutal Lefanav. So he said, Misha Mesa Mutal Lefanav was Eichel B'Vayas Acher. He should eat in a different house. And I pointed out at the time, what does a different house mean? Does a different house mean literally a different house, or literally means a different room? Here we have the same thing. When he's saying that you can't be in the room, sleeping in a room, maybe Mishamash Vitasa in a room with a Sefer Torah. Oh, but Rav Shimon says you make a mechitza of 10 tefachim. That 10 tefachim, obviously not ideally, but you can make a mechitza of 10 tefachim. But he says, no, Rav Shimon is not saying it ideally. He's saying not ideally. You don't make just a mechitza of 10 tefachim as an ideal thing. If you don't have an option, that's what you do. But if you have a bayis acha, then you put in the bayis acha. What did he mean? Does it mean literally a different house? You look in the Magen Avram. The Magen Avram says that bayis acha. None of the Rishonim explain this, but the Magen Avram says in Reish Mem, Sifkat and Vav, the Magen Avram says that bayis acha means a cheder acha, means a different room. So here it could come out that there are those who are very machmer not to have a Sefer Torah in the house, who don't want to have a Sefer Torah in the house. That was my first speech that I gave in this shul when we moved in here, was this Magen Avram, this issue about sleeping in a house with a Sefer Torah. And I answered what I answered, then I'm not getting into it now. But for our purposes now, for those that are very makbid not to have a Sefer Torah in a house, you can see why B'bayas Acher could be understood not as a cheder acher, but as literally a house. Okay, continues the Gemara. We have to just finish up here. Says the Gemara, Amar Rav Schera. Right, we said how much does the person have to distance himself from Tzoya? Arba Amos. Amar Rav Schera, Amar Huna Lo Shtana Ela La'Chera. V'Aval Fana Ma'achim Ole Einu. What do we mean? We say you have to distance yourself Dalet Amos. That's only when the Tzoya is behind you. But if it's in front of you, you can't be within eyesight of it at all. You have to be distancing yourself Mole Einu. V'Chein L'Tfila. So too it comes to Shemon Esrei as well. Eni V'Amar Rav from Bar Papa. Amar Rav Chizda. Amar Adam Keneged Beis HaKisei Mispel. But we have a memory that says that you're able to stand next to a Beis HaKisei and daven. So what does that mean? Don't you have to be distancing yourself? How come asking in Beis HaKisei she'en by tzara? We're talking about a Beis HaKisei that hasn't got any tzara. Says, well, really? Any? Is that such a thing possible to have a Beis HaKisei that doesn't have tzara? V'amar Rav Yosef bar Chanina Beis HaKisei she'amru. When we're talking about a Beis HaKisei like this, is afal pi she'en by tzara, or Beis HaMerchet she'amru afal pi she'en by adam. A Beis HaKisei that hasn't got any tzara, and Beis HaMerchet that hasn't got any people. In such a situation, then it will be permitted. So it says the Gemara, Al Hakam Askin and B'charati. We're talking about a situation where there's a Beis HaKisei charati. You have a new Beis HaKisei. A new Beis HaKisei doesn't have any tzaya. So if a new Beis HaKisei doesn't have any tzaya, then we're saying it's going to be permitted to be davening next to it. It says the Gemara, really? This is a question that Ravina had asked. Is minu le Beis HaKisei ma'u? If somebody prepared something to become a Beis HaKisei kavua, is that zimun itself enough to make it now also to be reciting the Shema next to it or not? Says the Gemara, Kikam Ravina, Lamekim Allah, let's that the question of Ravina was only as to whether or not you could daven within the Beis HaKisei, I'll connect there, but to daven next to it, that was never a question. Amar Rabba, Hani Bati Knesiyai, Hani Bati Kisoy de Parsoi, these Bati Kesiyais of the Parsiim, of the Persians, Afagav the ispu tsoya, even though they have tsoya in it, kistuminam, they're considered sealed up because the tsoya doesn't remain. There's different understandings what that means. But for Rashi's purposes here, Rashi says that they have a situation where the tsoya goes into the thing, into the hole, but there's a slant shaft that takes it away. And therefore, maybe this explains the Gemara Chefsan Beis that we had before. That Gamliel said that he said there was Shlosh Dvar Mani Oyev Esaparsim. One of the things was that the Sanu and Beis Kise, maybe because of the kinds of bathrooms that they had. All right, we'll have to stop here.